Throughout fiction and reality, there are people who use their powers for good and some for evil. What they have in common is that they relish in their strength. They show it off and brand it to the world. It's rare that you get a case where power is a symbol of trauma, and Liz Sherman is one with such a case. A reluctant human with great power but even greater pain, she is an example of what happens when we can use the weight of our trauma, the weight of our fears, as a weapon against the weapons forged against us. Elizabeth Ann Sherman was born in Kansas City, Kansas on April 15, 1962. Her family was strict and she was raised Catholic. They took her to Catholic school and even made her attend Mass twice a week. Liz's pyrokinetic powers first manifested when she was 10 years old. They appeared as small fires at first, no bigger than a match. They would appear near her, seemingly harmless, and she would extinguish them before they spread, while trying to keep them secret from her family. But by February of 1973, she could keep them a secret no longer. As her powers grew worse, Liz began to blame herself. She tortured herself into thinking that it was some kind of punishment for some form of sin she had committed. She thought that if she could only pray the sin away, it would vanish. This was the only way she found to manage her guilt. And for a time, this all seemed to work. And for a few months, she was okay. Until July of 1973, when a neighborhood boy made fun of her ponytail, which resulted in her losing her cool and burning an entire city block, which killed 32 people, including her entire family. When it was all over, firefighters found her without a scratch in the middle of the smoldering rubble. The BPRD came onto the scene to retrieve Liz, but her extended family wanted custody of her. They didn't believe her when she said she started the fire. And as she began to get passed around from home to home, her depression and her detachment grew until once again, her powers began to appear around her. And due to fear of what she could do, she finally became a ward of the BPRD in May of 1974. When the BPRD finally acquired Liz, they kept her at more than arm's length in a flame-proof room, where she was treated more like a monster and a freak than a human being. Bureau scientists made contact with her in bulky hazmat suits, and with no contact with the outside world, Liz dove deeper into depression. Her isolation was finally broken by Hellboy, who became her closest friend and big brother figure. Hellboy helped her overcome trauma, fear, and isolation, and helped her adjust to her new home in the BPRD. And for the next 6 years, Liz and Hellboy became extremely close. And even when he traveled on his assignments, Hellboy made sure to check in on Liz regularly. When he was away, she trained with both the BPRD scientists and independent experts in pyrokinesis. And because of this, she developed at least a moderate control over her powers. In 1978, Liz had the pleasure of meeting Abe Sapien. The both of them became close friends due to their mutual liberation from isolation by Hellboy. Like Liz, Abe was placed in isolation, studied, and treated less than human. She saw herself in him and welcomed him with open arms. While Liz still occasionally had nightmares about the fire that killed her family, she gradually began to take control of her pain and torment, and the number of accidental flare-ups continued to steadily decrease. In 1980, Liz was finally an adult and made her own decision to remain with the BPRD. They offered her a full field agent position, and while she was game to take it, her struggle to control her powers had not fully gone away. In stressful situations, she often lost control of her power, and as a result, she was often assigned to smaller cases. And between 1980 and 1994, Liz went through an emotional roller coaster. quitting the BPRD 12 times, even though she always returned no matter how much she wanted to leave. She could never bring herself to enter the outside world because of the fear of what she might do. May of 1994 brought on a new set of problems. Abe, Liz, and Hellboy traveled to Cavendish Hall, the place I mentioned previously in Rasputin's file, to investigate the murder of BPRD director Trevor Burtonholm. During the course of this investigation, Rasputin took control of Liz's powers, funneling it through the creature Saduhim and into the void, where he hoped to free the Ogdu Jihad from its prison. After being saved by Abe, Liz was traumatized by the amount of stress and damage her mind, body, and soul had gone through, and once again, she lost control of her powers. This caused her to create a massive explosion that destroyed both the Saduhim and Cavendish Hall. The trauma from that event caused her to quit the BPRD for the 13th time in June of 1994, but she soon returned again in February of 1995. She couldn't trust her powers at the BPRD, but she definitely couldn't trust them in the world outside. Her mind was in a constant state of a tug of war. Being raped spiritually by dark beings threw her into a spiral she could not climb out of. In 1997, Liz joined agents Bud Waller and Sidney Leach on a search for the body of a familiar vampire we all may know, Vladimir Juriscu. This search led them to discover the body of a human-sized homunculus, and sensing a way to be rid of her fire, she put her finger into a hole in its chest. Her flames drained into the homunculus, bringing it to life. Agent Waller panicked, and in order to try to break the connection, he shot Liz in the arm. In response to this, the homunculus killed him and ran off. Liz's fire was integral to her life, and the price of the exchange was deeper than she could ever imagine. With her fire gone, she was drained and was later taken to a Romanian hospital where she wasted away and died. She was only dead for a few minutes, however, because the homunculus, which Hellboy named Roger, gave her back her flames and restored her to life. In February of 2000, Liz returned to work, but with so much going on in her head and death taking its own toll on her, she decided to leave the BPRD and travel to a monastery to work with monks in order to gain some form of balance and confidence within herself and make peace with her flames. For the next 2 years, Liz began to get a hold of her powers and finally gained some form of equilibrium. Her time at the monastery would soon come to an end in September of 2002, when the descendants of a Hyperborean slave race, led by the King of Fear, attacked the monastery. The King of Fear is a part of a race which was known as the Servants of the Left Hand. They were created by an underground sect of prehumans, also known as the Left Hand, who chose to remain underground. The Left Hand created the king and his kind as slaves to maintain various machines and devices they had built. The slaves led a revolt and wiped out their masters. Thousands of years had passed, and the king began to gather his forces and find a way to rebuild the machines and conquer the world above. And with this, he turned his sights on Liz Sherman. The slaves stormed the monastery and murdered all of the monks. They stole her spirit out of her body and placed it in a device they hoped would power the old machines and help them take over the world. Liz somehow was able to contact Abe in this state, and he mobilized a BPRD rescue mission. Liz was rescued and her spirit was restored to her body. Though shaken by this experience, Liz retained her newfound balance and was soon able to travel once again with the BPRD and go on assignments. Things would be quiet for the time being until the routine sweep of Cavendish Hall would lead to the BPRD scientists discovering a spore that grew into an earthly manifestation of Saduhim. It escaped the BPRD HQ and traveled to Crab Point, Michigan, where it transformed an entire town into frog creatures. And while Liz and the BPRD fought back as much as they could, she could not stop the frog creatures from escaping, and thus began the Frog Wars. The Frog Wars are events that I will cover in another video, but just know that the Frog War is one of the major events in Hellboy canon, and it changed the lives of those who were involved forever. While destroying a nest of frogs in Handleston, Montana, an old woman approached Liz and gave her a lotus blossom. This caused Liz to fall into a coma, where she met a mysterious man that was able to tell her about the frog creatures and helped her channel her energy to destroy an enormous amount of them, including Kathahem, one of the Otruhim that was summoned by the frog creatures. Liz Sherman is one of the most powerful members of the BPRD. She takes on the trauma and weight of their experiences, and on top of that, she also carries her own. She's never afraid to speak her mind, and when she knows something doesn't add up, she goes to it right away. Like a true goddess, Elizabeth's very breath is fire. Her life, her essence, all flames that fuel and drive the BPRD. And even in her darkest times, she never gives up. This is not the end of her journey, and the trials and tribulations she experiences going forward are ones that will test life itself.